In the heavy, suffocating heat of the summer of 1851, a single hour in Yazoo County, Mississippi, would become etched into legend. 17 of the county's most prominent citizens collapsed and died one after another during what historians would later call the most mysterious mass poisoning of the antebellum South. Among the dead were 3 state legislators, 2 circuit court judges, 4 wealthy plantation owners, and 8 members of their families. They had all gathered at Willowbrook Plantation guests of Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford for a grand feast commemorating 25 years of what Rutherford proudly called his profitable agricultural enterprise. It was meant to be a celebration of power, wealth, and longevity. Instead, it became a moment of horror that exposed just how fragile those foundations really were. What investigators uncovered in the weeks that followed shook Mississippi society to its core. Secrets so disturbing emerged that the official records were sealed away for nearly a century. Only recently have the case files dusted and brittle discovered in the basement of the Yazoo County Courthouse come to light. Inside them is the account of a vengeance so calculated, so exacting, that even today researchers marvel at its precision. And at the center of it all was a woman whose name appears in the ledgers with chilling simplicity: Celia. An enslaved cook who many believe orchestrated the deadly feast. Before we step deeper into her story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. We love connecting with our audience across America because history, after all, touches every corner of this country. The investigation that followed would not only reveal the likely perpetrator, but would also expose an entire system of cruelty concealed for decades behind the polished veneer of Mississippi's plantation elite. For years, Willowbrook Plantation sprawled across 4,000 fertile acres, its white-columned house towering above endless rows of cotton. It was an empire of staggering wealth built on the backs of more than 200 enslaved men, women, and children. At its head stood Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford, a man who prided himself not just on profit, but on what he called discipline through creative correction. Willowbrook had been established in 1826, when Rutherford, then a young officer, freshly returned from the War of 1812, used his inheritance from his father's Virginia tobacco fortune to purchase the land. By 1851, the plantation was renowned not only for its productivity, but for Rutherford's innovations in slave management. Other planters traveled from as far as Georgia and South Carolina to witness his so-called educational entertainments. These gatherings were staged in a specially built pavilion behind the main house where Rutherford turned punishment into spectacle. Judges, politicians, wealthy neighbors, and their wives would dine on lavish meals while watching carefully choreographed displays of brutality. To Rutherford, punishment was a performance, and witnesses were essential. Enslaved workers were forced to attend as well-made to observe the torture of others in silence. The woman tasked with preparing the meals for these grotesque gatherings was Celia, recorded in plantation documents as Celia Cook, aged about 35 years, property of J. Rutherford. Purchased as a teenager in 1833 from a trader in Natchez, she had been chosen for her rare knowledge of food preparation skills passed down from her grandmother, a woman born in West Africa who possessed deep understanding of plants and their properties. For nearly 2 decades, Celia labored in Willowbrook's kitchen, a stone outbuilding, with 3 vast hearths, heavy oak preparation tables, and shelves crowded with jars of herbs, spices, and preserved ingredients. From its windows, she could hear the pavilion. Every cry for mercy, every crack of the whip, every roar of laughter from the guests drifted into the kitchen as she worked. Meals for cruelty and meals for celebration were prepared in the same space, and Celia bore witness to both. Her own suffering was quiet but relentless. She had borne 4 children during her years at Willowbrook, 2 daughters and 2 sons. Her first daughter, born in 1835, was sold at the age of 7 to a cotton merchant in New Orleans. Her first son, born in 1837, was killed at 12 years old during one of Rutherford's educational demonstrations, punished for the crime of stealing bread. Her second daughter, born in 1841, died of pneumonia at just 6 after a winter spent in the unheated slave quarters. Only her youngest child remained, Marcus, born in 1844, a boy of 7 by the time of the feast. He worked long days in the cotton fields, watched constantly by overseers armed with whips and pistols. For Celia, Marcus was her last surviving tether to life, her final hope. And it was perhaps for him that she began to plan. The records of Willowbrook Plantation, kept with meticulous care by overseer Benjamin Harwick, reveal the cold, systematic cruelty that defined daily life there. Between 1840 and 1851, 17 enslaved people were documented as having died directly from disciplinary measures. 12 more were sold away from their families as punishment, while countless others were maimed or left permanently disabled. Harwick's ledgers noted these human tragedies with the same dry precision he used to record cotton harvests or the purchase of new plows. One chilling entry reads, "Negro boy Samuel, aged 14, died from correction administered for insolence. Disposal cost $250 for burial." What made Willowbrook particularly sinister was not merely the violence itself, but Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford's belief that it represented progress. He styled himself an innovator, a man of intellect. He corresponded frequently with other planters across the South, promoting his philosophy as though it was science. In a letter dated March 15, 1851, found among his papers, Rutherford wrote to a planter in Alabama, "The key to managing our peculiar institution lies not in random brutality, but in calculated demonstration. When punishment becomes spectacle, it serves dual purposes: correction for the individual and education for the masses. My dinner guests consistently remark upon the effectiveness of my methods, and my cotton yields remain among the highest in the county." Celia had seen every one of these demonstrations. She prepared the elegant courses that accompanied nights of screams and sobs. She served men and women who applauded Rutherford's cruelty as though it were theatre. She had seen her son Marcus, only a child, forced to stand among the others, eyes wide with terror that would never fully leave him. She had listened to the tinkling laughter of fine ladies, glasses of wine in their hands, as they debated which punishments seemed most effective. By the spring of 1851, however, something in Celia had changed. Other enslaved workers later recalled that she grew quieter, more focused. Her time increasingly spent in the kitchen gardens, tending to overlooked plants. She asked subtle questions about guest lists, about menus, about upcoming gatherings. She moved with the stillness that belied the storm beginning to build within her. The announcement came on a blistering June morning. Colonel Rutherford summoned every enslaved worker to the courtyard for what he called a proclamation of significance. Standing tall on the porch of his grand mansion, dressed in his finest white linen, despite the suffocating heat, he declared that Willowbrook would host its grandest celebration. Yet, a feast to honor 25 years of agricultural success and social enlightenment. The guest list, reconstructed later from Rutherford's correspondence, read like a directory of Mississippi's most powerful families. State Senator Augustus Pembroke, renowned for fiery speeches defending slavery as God's will, was to attend with his wife and grown children. Circuit Judge Thaddeus Claiborne, who in 2 decades had never once ruled in favor of an enslaved person seeking freedom, would arrive with his family from Jackson. The wealthy Havenshire brothers of Madison County, Colonel Robert Fleming of Hinds County, and the widowed Mrs. Cordelia Van Cleve, mistress of the largest cotton operation in Warren County, all confirmed their attendance. But behind the grandeur lurked something darker still. According to documents later seized by federal marshals, Rutherford planned to unveil what he called his ultimate correction, a punishment so severe it would crown his entire disciplinary philosophy. The intended subject of this performance was Marcus Celia's 7-year-old son. His crime in Rutherford's eyes was that he had dared to cry during a previous demonstration. Celia learned of her child's fate not from any formal notice, but through a whisper and overheard conversation while she served the overseer's family. The knowledge struck her like a blow to the chest, but outwardly she betrayed nothing. No tears, no fury, no trembling. She buried it all deep beneath a mask of composure. Inside, however, she began to plan. With a precision that might have impressed military strategists, she mapped out what would become her own form of justice. The date was set, Saturday, July 12th, 1851, 1 month away. 30 days. 30 days to prepare not only the most elaborate menu Willowbrook had ever seen, but a reckoning long overdue. She studied the guest list as carefully as a physician studies a patient. She learned each person's tastes, their preferred dishes, their peculiar habits at the table. And then with quiet determination, she began her work. Celia watched carefully as the weeks of preparation unfolded. When distinguished visitors arrived early to consult with Colonel Rutherford, she observed them from the quiet shadows of the dining room and kitchen. She noted who ate greedily and who showed restraint, who preferred whiskey to wine, who lingered over sweets, and who favored savory dishes. Every detail was filed away not out of servitude but out of calculation. Her plan depended not only on food, but on human behavior. And as she studied, she also began to gather the true instruments of her vengeance, not from the larder, but from the land itself. The forests and fields surrounding Willowbrook Plantation held a dangerous knowledge, a natural pharmacy of both cure and curse. Long before European settlers carved the land into cotton fields, the indigenous people of Mississippi had used its plants in medicine and in war. Celia's grandmother, born in West Africa, had carried with her the wisdom of plants, teaching Celia as a child that survival sometimes depended on knowing which leaves healed and which roots killed. Along the marshy eastern border of the plantation grew water hemlock, its roots heavy with cicotoxin, capable of bringing convulsions and death in mere hours. Along the fence lines sprouted castor beans, their seeds containing ricin, a poison that inflicted days of unbearable agony before death. Even the ornamental oleander bushes Mrs. Rutherford had planted for beauty hid cardiac toxins powerful enough to stop a human heart. But the most valuable of all was a grove of pokeweed nestled in a secluded ravine, its roots concealing saponins that, when prepared with care, could be transformed into a tasteless powder. Celia's grandmother had once whispered stories of women in the Caribbean who had used such plants to poison cruel masters, though the act was always paid for with their own lives. So in the pre-dawn darkness, Celia began her quiet harvests. She gathered roots and berries in silence, her hands steady, though her heart raged. She dried them in a hidden corner of the root cellar, carefully grinding and preparing them by the techniques passed down to her in half-remembered lessons of childhood. The work was perilous. One slip of measurement, one wrong preparation, and the poison could claim her before her plan even began. Around her, the plantation buzzed with feverish activity. Rutherford ordered new uniforms for his household staff, fresh coats of paint for the mansion, and garlands to adorn the dining hall. He hired a string quartet from Jackson commissioned silver goblets engraved with his initials and planned the feast as though it would be remembered for centuries. In this, he was correct, but not for the reasons he believed. The greatest challenge for Celia was timing. Poisons worked on their own clocks, some swift and violent, others slow and insidious. Too fast and suspicion would fall on the meal and on her. Too slow and some might leave before the poison took hold. After weeks of thought, she devised a multi-layered design, an invisible trap from which none of Rutherford's guests would escape. The wine would carry the water hemlock extract, ensuring the first symptoms appeared quickly. The cornbread, a staple she knew every guest would eat, would conceal pokeweed powder, drawing out the agony in their bodies. The dessert's delicate confections prepared for the final course would carry the essence of oleander, sealing their fate with the sweetness of death. As the date approached, Celia showed no trace of the storm gathering within her. She smiled politely, served her master's wife, and prepared meals as she always had. Outwardly, she was the same quiet cook she had been for 18 years. Inwardly, she counted the days, the hours, the breaths until the appointed moment. At last, Saturday, July 12th, 1851 arrived. The morning air was heavy with an oppressive humidity that clung to every surface like a damp shroud. By mid-morning, the heat pressed down on Willowbrook Plantation so intensely that even the shade of the great oaks offered no relief. Celia rose at 3 o'clock as she had each day that month, but today carried a weight unlike any other. In the flickering lamplight of the kitchen, she moved with solemn purpose. She reviewed the poisons she had prepared, counted, and recounted the carefully measured doses and rehearsed again the sequence of the feast in her mind. The menu had been approved weeks earlier by Colonel Rutherford himself, who demanded dishes that would showcase Willowbrook's prosperity and Celia's skill. The first course would be turtle soup, a delicacy requiring days of preparation, meant to impress the guests with both rarity and refinement. And for Celia, it would mark the beginning of the end. The grand feast was designed as both spectacle and statement. After the turtle soup, the table would carry roasted duck with wild rice, dressing venison steaks glazed with bourbon crisp fried catfish in cornmeal crust, and a procession of sides, butter beans simmered with pork fat, candied sweet potatoes, golden cornbread, and jars of pickled vegetables gleaming like jewels under candlelight. The finale would be peach cobbler and frothy syllabub, accompanied by imported French wines and the fiery burn of local whiskey. Each course presented its own opportunity. The earthy bitterness of pokeweed extract would vanish beneath the heavy flavors of the turtle soup. Water hemlock root powder would blend seamlessly into the bourbon glaze for the venison. and the oleander ground, and measured with deadly care, would dissolve into the sugary sweetness of the desserts, an invisible death hidden beneath whipped cream and peaches. Celia had tested each mixture on herself in minute doses, enduring the dizziness, the nausea, the burning in her gut, all to prove that the poisons remained both potent and undetectable. By dawn, the kitchen swelled with activity. Other servants arrived unaware that they were unwitting participants in the most precise mass poisoning Mississippi would ever record. Celia directed them with a calm authority that betrayed none of her inner storm. Sarah, just 18 and eager to please, was set to trimming vegetables and arranging flowers. Old Moses, who had worked at Willowbrook since its founding, polished silver and set the great oak table. Maria pulled from the fields to help stoke the fires and scrub dishes. None of them were permitted near the dishes Celia reserved for her own hands. Those would carry the weight of her vengeance. By mid-morning, the first of the guests arrived. Senator Pembroke's carriage rolled up the drive, 4 bay horses glistening with sweat, silver harness bells announcing his presence. Soon after, Judge Claiborne appeared with his wife and 3 children, their coach adorned with the seal of Mississippi's Circuit Court. The Havenshire brothers followed on horseback, their voices loud with talk of cotton prices and the growing menace of abolitionists. One by one, the most powerful men and women of Yazoo County ascended Willowbrook's steps. Colonel Rutherford, sweltering in his formal black coat, greeted them with bourbon toddies and grand declarations about friendship, prosperity, and the civilizing hand of agriculture. The ladies fanned themselves in the parlor over iced tea and gossip, while the gentlemen gathered on the porch to smoke cigars and argue politics. From the kitchen window, Celia watched. She saw Mrs. Pembroke dabbing her forehead with a lace kerchief, Judge Claiborne's young daughter cradling a wooden doll on the porch steps, Colonel Fleming proudly displaying a new whip to a circle of admiring planters. These were the same people who had applauded when Rutherford turned punishment into entertainment, who had smiled as children screamed, who had murdered her son for bread. And tonight before midnight, they would all lie silent. At 2 o'clock, Rutherford announced the evening's entertainment and educational demonstration at 6:30, followed by the great dinner at 7:30. The timing was perfect. The cruelty of the pavilion would intoxicate his guests with power, dull their senses, and mask the first whispers of poison. Celia's heart clenched when she learned that Marcus, her last living child, had been locked away since the night before, selected as the subject of Rutherford's demonstration. She could hear his muffled cries from the storage shed near the pavilion. For a moment, her hands trembled, grief threatening to shatter her precision. But she forced herself steady. Rage and sorrow would serve her only if sharpened into focus. As the shadows lengthened and cicadas began their evening chorus, Celia turned to her final preparations. Each dish now bore not just flavor, but purpose. Each plate a weapon disguised as a gift. The house above hummed with laughter and music. In the kitchen below, death was being plated. The turtle soup simmered in great iron cauldrons, its fragrance of herbs and spices filling the kitchen, disguising the bitter thread of pokeweed Celia had slipped into the broth hours earlier. Ducks roasted slowly, their skins blistering to golden crispness, while venison steaks waited beside the fire, already soaked in a bourbon marinade, laced with enough water hemlock to silence a dozen men. But it was the cornbread that gave Celia the sharpest, pride. Golden, fragrant, perfect in every way, and each loaf was a weapon baked with a precise measure of powdered pork root that promised death within 6 hours. None would suspect. None would survive. By late afternoon, when the day's heat pressed down like a heavy hand, Celia dismissed her assistants, telling them she needed solitude for the delicate finishing touches. No one questioned her. Perfection was expected from Celia. In truth, she needed silence, privacy for the final and most dangerous act, the poisoning of the wine. In the cool dampness of the root cellar, she worked by candlelight hands, steady despite the tremors of rage and grief that rattled her chest. 3 bottles of Rutherford's prized Bordeaux stood before her, their wax seals intact, their labels bearing the names of European nobility. She had rehearsed this moment for weeks. The corks slid out silently beneath her practiced hand. Into each bottle, she measured the invisible extract of water hemlock, colorless, tasteless, merciless. She recorked them, sealed them again with wax melted and stained to match, dusted the bottles with cellar earth, and placed them back among their kin as if untouched. They would kill within minutes. Above her, laughter and voices swelled as guests moved toward the punishment pavilion. Celia heard the rise of excited chatter, the false protestations of ladies who pretended shock, even as they leaned forward in fascination, the guttural approval of men who called violence discipline. And then through it all, Marcus's sobs, thin, broken, terrified, carried through the humid evening air. Her son, 7 years old, chosen as entertainment. The sound cut into her like a blade, but it did not shake her resolve. Instead, it steadied her hands, sharpened her vision. Every dish she plated was no longer just food, it was justice disguised as sustenance. At 6:30, as the sun sank through curtains of Spanish moss and the cicadas began their chorus, the demonstration began. Celia could not block it out entirely. The shouts, the gasps, the dull thud of cruelty carried across the yard. Still, she worked, ladling turtle soup into porcelain bowls that gleamed like ivory. She carved the ducks, their juices glistening the glaze, sweet and deadly. She seared venison to perfection its charred surface, hiding the lethal powder within. She sliced the cornbread and laid it in baskets lined with immaculate white linen. Every motion was precise, ritualistic, final. When the worst sounds from the pavilion subsided, Celia uncorked the 3 Bordeaux bottles and let them breathe. A gesture of respect to the wine, to the ritual of the feast, but also the final step in binding the poison to its host. Now they were indistinguishable from any other fine vintage. Now they were the perfect trap. By 7:30, the guests returned from the pavilion, their faces flushed with drink and cruelty, their voices bright with morbid excitement. Celia rang the dinner bell. It echoed across the plantation, summoning them not to celebration but to judgment. The dining hall at Willowbrook gleamed with the trappings of wealth. Chandeliers dripped with light. Oil paintings of pastoral abundance lined the walls, mocking the unseen suffering that had produced it all. A massive mahogany table stretched the length of the room, dressed in white linen, sterling silver polished to blinding brilliance. Crystal goblets that refracted candle flames into shards of color. The stage was set not for prosperity, but for ruin. Colonel Rutherford took his seat at the head of the table, cheeks still flushed from the spectacle of Marcus's suffering. To his right sat Senator Pembroke, whose entire career was built on defending slavery as divine order. To his left, Judge Claiborne, wrapped now in silk and satin instead of his judicial robes, though his cold eyes still carried the weight of verdicts that had chained thousands in misery. One by one, the architects of Celia's grief leaned forward, lifted their goblets and smiled, and above them all, unseen death waited patiently in every dish. The remaining guests arranged themselves with the rigid precision demanded by Mississippi's planter aristocracy. Every seat was a signal, every placement a reminder of status and acreage. The Hovenshaw brothers, masters of 6,000 acres of cotton and 600 souls, occupied the center of the table, speaking of purchases and profits as though they discussed weather and harvest, not human lives. Mrs. Van Cleve, the formidable widow, whose shrewd dealings made her one of the wealthiest women in the state, was seated with courtesy, but never equality. Her presence tolerated because her fortune outweighed the impropriety of her sex. When Celia emerged from the kitchen, bearing the first course, no one truly saw her. To them, she was not a woman, not a mother, not the architect of their destruction. She was only service-embodied, silent, efficient, the same familiar shadow she had been for 18 years. They did not recognize the fire in her chest or the vengeance measured into each delicate dish. The turtle soup arrived, steaming each porcelain bowl crowned with sprigs of herbs. The garnish disguised the earthy undertone of pokeweed extract that infused every serving subtle and inexorable. Around the table, conversation turned to the evening's earlier spectacle. I must say, Jeremiah Senator Pembroke intoned, spoon-raised with stately precision, "Your methods continue to impress me. The systematic nature of your approach to correction provides an example sorely needed by those less enlightened in the management of their stock." He swallowed spoonfuls of poison without pause, lips slick with broth that carried his death. Judge Claiborne, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin, offered solemn agreement. Quite so. Spectacle amplifies discipline. The punishment of one becomes the instruction of hundreds. In my own court, the public sentence carries equal weight in its deterrent power. Fear is a language they cannot help but learn. One by one, bowls were emptied, porcelain scraped clean by silver spoons. None felt the first stirring of the extract, though it had already begun its slow destruction, blood seeping where it should not, invisible damage blooming in silence. Celia gathered the dishes with steady hands. Not a flicker of triumph crossed her face. She was the same servant they had always known, and yet she had already dealt the first blow. The second course followed, roasted duck, carved with elegance, presented beside wild rice, rich with bacon fat, rendered from hogs raised on acorns fallen across Willowbrook's punishment grounds. The irony was perfect flesh, flavored by a soil soaked with decades of blood. But no guest recognized the poetry of it. They tasted only fat and smoke sweetness and salt. It was the glaze that carried death most swiftly. Bourbon thickened with hemlock, its potency masked by sweetness, its bitterness dissolved into fire and oak. Each bite a promise, each swallow a countdown. Within 30 minutes, the first cracks would show. Yet, as they ate, their talk flowed toward loftier matters. Colonel Fleming, notorious even among his peers for inventive cruelties, carved into his portion with practiced ease. Recent studies in cranial measurement, he declared, prove what every planter has long understood. The Negro skull is smaller, its structure deficient in faculties of reason and moral judgment. Our hierarchy, therefore, is not only profitable, but scientific indeed, divinely ordained. His knife cut flesh, his fork carried poison to his lips, and death moved silently through his veins as he spoke of natural order. The women at the table joined the conversation with a zeal that matched their husbands. Mrs. Pembroke, the senator's wife, spoke with the authority of one who had long overseen the management of enslaved people in her household. Negroes require constant oversight and frequent correction, or else even the simplest standards collapse, she remarked, lifting a forkful of the deadly second course to her lips. Left unattended, they sink immediately into idleness and insubordination. The demonstrations we witnessed this evening are essential reminders that discipline is the cornerstone of a properly ordered home. Meanwhile, Celia moved quietly among them, her presence as subtle as the air itself. She refilled water glasses, replenished bread, adjusted the placement of silver, her movements efficient and invisible, perfectly tuned to the rhythm of service. Nothing in her demeanor betrayed that she was conducting the most delicate work of her life. With each pass, she studied the faces around the table, noting how they relished the very meal that was killing them. Their laughter ringing over conversations of cruelty and punishment, as though such topics belonged naturally to fine dining. The third course arrived, venison steaks grilled with exquisite care, each portion seared to the precise preference of its guest. A rich bourbon glaze, dark and gleaming, coated the meat, its sweetness hiding another layer of poison. The venison had been marinated for a full day in herbs and spices, chosen not only for flavor, but for their ability to mask the bitter trace of water hemlock that threaded through every bite. By now, nearly 45 minutes had passed since the first dose had been consumed. The most immediate toxins were beginning their work. The earliest signs were indistinguishable from the ordinary discomforts of a long dinner. A guest felt slightly lightheaded, surely the wine. Another noticed a tingling in the fingers, easily blamed on sitting too long. A faint shift in vision could be explained by flickering candlelight. Senator Pembroke was the first to falter. In mid-sentence, while discussing the strategies of his re-election campaign, he pressed his fingertips to his temple, wincing. "I fear this heat affects me more than I realized," he muttered, though the room was cool, softened by evening breezes and cross-drafted windows. A few minutes later, Judge Claiborne lifted his wineglass and noticed his hand trembling. He laughed it off, fatigue from travel perhaps. In truth, it was the earliest ripple of neurological failure, the poison beginning to short-circuit the delicate workings of his nervous system. And then the wine service began. 3 bottles of Bordeaux, their labels gleaming, were presented with ceremony befitting the occasion. Crystal goblets caught the candlelight as Celia poured with practiced precision. Colonel Rutherford rose glass raised and declared a toast to 25 years of prosperity and enlightenment. Every guest lifted their glass in unison, a final shared gesture. The wine was flawless, velvety rich, the very essence of celebration. It carried only one imperfection. Each crystal bowl held a dose of water hemlock strong enough to kill within the hour. Tasteless, colorless, blended seamlessly into the vintage, it sealed their fate with elegance. As they savored what they believed was a rare treasure of the cellar, their talk returned to the same themes: cruelty and commerce dressed as civility. Mrs. Vankel, whose fortune in Mississippi had made her a social force in her own right, lifted her glass again and spoke with satisfaction about the economic advantages of what she called proper labor management. The profitability of cotton cultivation, she had once insisted, depended entirely on maintaining rigid discipline among the enslaved. Sentiment, she warned, was dangerous. It led only to inefficiency, rebellion, and decline. Those words, remembered now as she swallowed the final mouthful of poisoned wine, had been meant as doctrine. Instead, they became her epitaph. What she called a scientific approach to labor relations, the cold machinery of control and exploitation, was collapsing around her in a silence more absolute than any rebellion could have achieved. Just when it seemed the horrors of Willowbrook had reached their limit, the night deepened. And if this story has already unsettled you, imagine being in that room. Share this tale with someone who loves histories that walk the razor's edge between fact and nightmare. A quiet like goes further than you think, and subscribing ensures you never miss what waits in the shadows of the past. For now, let's remain here at the feast and watch what happened next. By 9 o'clock, the poisons revealed themselves in ways that could no longer be ignored or explained away. The water hemlock, hidden in both the duck glaze and the wine, began its cruel work on the nervous system. The pokeweed compounds, folded into soup and cornbread, attacked from another direction, rupturing blood vessels from within. Even if no other substance had been added, this alone would have proved fatal. Senator Pembroke was the first whose mask began to slip. His words, once sharp, grew slow and deliberate, an attempt to disguise the slurring of his tongue. His hand trembled so violently that lifting his glass without spilling became an ordeal, his eyes crossing and uncrossing as though the room itself had turned traitor. Judge Claiborne gripped his stomach in discomfort that he tried to blame on overeating. In truth, the saponins from pokeweed were tearing through his digestive tract. Blood was already beginning to seep where it should not. His mind too was fraying. Sentences trailed off halfway through his gaze, slipping across the parlor as if he no longer remembered why he was there. The Havenshire brothers fared no better. Flushed faces, shallow breaths, and the pounding of irregular hearts betrayed the oleander hidden in the butter. The glycosides coursing through their veins promised cardiac failure before the night was done. Across the table, Mrs. Van Cleve swallowed hard against nausea, her pride insisting she betray no weakness before friends or rivals. Yet within her stomach lining, blistered under pokeweed's assault, and her senses warped under the weight of hemlock's touch. Shadows danced where no one stood, and the timing of sound seemed broken voices reaching her as though from underwater. Even Colonel Rutherford, host of the gathering, could no longer disguise his distress. Vertigo tipped the room sideways, and searing pain grew in his abdomen as bleeding spread unseen. Still, he forced himself upright, unwilling to reveal the chaos inside his body. And yet, despite the creeping collapse around the long table, no one dared speak it aloud. Antebellum decorum held them all captive. To complain to admit illness would mean drawing attention, something unthinkable in this world of rigid social codes. So they smiled, and they nodded, and they swallowed the poisons that would carry them to their fate. This unspoken code of manners worked perfectly in Celia's favor. The longer the guests insisted on polite silence, The further the poisons advanced, reaching the point when no doctor, even had one been summoned, could have reversed the damage. Their bodies were already unraveling, organs failing one by one, even as they tried to keep up the illusion of civilized conversation. The fourth course arrived: fried catfish, its cornmeal crust, golden and crisp, accompanied by butter beans laced with special herbs. To the unsuspecting eye, nothing seemed unusual, but within the crust Celia had folded in a fresh measure of pork extract, ensuring a fatal dose for even the most cautious eater. The beans carried their own secret, seasoned with oleander leaves ground so finely they blended seamlessly with the more familiar flavors. Death had been plated alongside tradition and served with elegance. By now, the effects were impossible to hide completely. Mrs. Pembroke, the senator's wife, struggled to keep her fork from clattering against the porcelain as tremors racked her hands. With forced laughter, she blamed her nerves on the excitement of the evening. But the truth was far darker. Cicotoxin was burning through her nervous system, stripping away her body's ability to obey her will. Colonel Fleming's breath came in shallow gasps. He tried to speak, but every sentence fractured, cut short by the effort it took to draw air. The oleander coursing through his veins had seized his heart in its invisible grip, tightening with each beat. He muttered something about the Mississippi humidity, but his pallor told another story. The younger guests fared even worse. Judge Claiborne's daughter, newlywed at 19, winced with cramps so severe she could barely sit upright. When she dabbed delicately at her lips, the napkin came away tinged with blood. Her husband whispered anxiously, but her eyes stayed on her plate, pride keeping her silent even as her body betrayed her. Through it all, Celia moved like a shadow, silent, efficient, unnoticed. She poured water-removed plates and replaced them with fresh dishes, her hands steady as marble. Not once did she falter. If anything, her calm mirrored the clinical detachment these same people had displayed while watching enslaved children beaten. Now, the roles were reversed. Conversations splintered, fractured by nausea, confusion, and blurred vision. Where earlier there had been animated debates about politics and discipline, now there were half-finished sentences, awkward silences, and the sound of uneven breathing. The veneer of antebellum grace was cracking piece by piece. By 9:30, the mask shattered entirely. Senator Pembroke rose abruptly, muttering something about stepping outside for fresh air. But his legs gave way beneath him, sending him crashing back into his chair with a force that rattled china and crystal alike. The room froze. For the first time, fear replaced pretense. "I believe I may be experiencing a medical episode," he gasped, his voice quivering with the terror he could no longer hide. Those words broke the dam. Judge Claiborne clutched his stomach, confessing waves of pain that made it impossible to go on. Miss Van Cleve admitted to visions and dizziness beyond anything she'd ever known. One by one, the survivors of denial gave way, voices rising in a chorus of panic. The feast was no longer a celebration. It had become a reckoning. The Horvenshire brothers clutched their chests, struggling for breath, their faces slick with sweat. What began as mild discomfort had now become unbearable pressure, each heartbeat a hammer against failing lungs. Sensing panic spreading through the room, Colonel Rutherford tried to reassert control. His voice trembled but carried the weight of authority. Perhaps he suggested the heat and humidity were to blame, or spoiled food. He ordered Celia to fetch the plantation doctor at once. But Celia had already foreseen this move. Hours earlier, she had ensured that no physician would reach Willowbrook in time. A false message had been sent to Dr. Harrison, telling him his services would not be required that evening. And the plantation's swiftest horses, those that might have carried desperate riders for help, had been relocated to distant pastures under the guise of better grazing. The escape routes had been sealed before the first toast was even raised. By now, whispers of suspicion began threading through the hall. Mrs. Van Cleve, sharp of mind, even as her body failed, voiced the unthinkable. "I believe we may have been poisoned." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. The consistency of their symptoms, she argued, could not be explained by heat or spoiled meat. All eyes turned toward Celia. Colonel Rutherford attempted to interrogate her, but the toxins had already clouded his judgment and fractured his thoughts into incoherence. Celia, outwardly calm, played the role of loyal servant, deflecting suspicion with measured grace. Perhaps it was the water she suggested. Perhaps some undetected illness moving quietly through the county. Her serenity, her willingness to answer bought her precious minutes. Minutes the poisons did not need, but used all the same. And yet, beneath the mask of innocence, Celia knew the truth. Her own fate was sealed. Whether by the dying hands of her masters or by the gallows, she would not live beyond this night. But that had always been the cost she was willing to pay for her son, for her kin, for every soul that had suffered beneath Willowbrook's shadow. By 10 o'clock, the room had collapsed into chaos. Convulsions seized bodies as cytotoxin reached its peak. Mouths frothed with blood as pokeweed tore through the stomach lining. Oleander seized hearts in its merciless grip, dragging guests into unconsciousness only to wrench them back into spasms of agony. The grand dining hall, once a showcase of wealth and refinement, now resembled the set of a nightmare. Chairs, overturned glasses, shattered silverware scattered across the floor. Blood and vomit stained the white linen cloth that had been chosen to dazzle and impress. And then the clock struck 10:30. What had begun as an anniversary celebration had become a vision of hell itself, one that even the most fevered Gothic imagination might have hesitated to conjure. The dining room, once a showcase of refinement, with crystal chandeliers blazing above, and oil paintings of pastoral peace upon the walls, had become a battlefield. Not one marked by sabers or gunfire, but by an invisible enemy, carried in every bite, every sip. Nourishment had been twisted into execution. Senator Pembroke, the orator who had thundered in defense of slavery as divine will, was now reduced to a convulsing body on the floor. His chair lay overturned beside him, his spine arched grotesquely with each seizure, his final words collapsing into garbled fragments no one could understand. Judge Claiborne, who had spent 2 decades denying the enslaved even the pretense of justice, drowned in his own blood. Pokeweed had shredded his stomach and intestines, each wretch sprayed crimson across linen once meant to dazzle guests. Oleander seized his heart in cruel rhythms, too fast, then too slow, leaving him trapped in a cycle of agony and suffocation. The Havenshire brothers, their fortunes built on innovations in forced labor, mirrored each other in synchronized collapse. Hands clutched at chests as their faces deepened into a ghastly shade of violet. They gasped against hearts that no longer obeyed. Mrs. Van Cleve, the calculating widow, turned plantation magnate, lost all semblance of dignity. Hallucinations blurred her fading mind. She reached out for figures no one else could see, even as blood seeped from mouth-nose and beneath her fingernails. And Colonel Rutherford, the master of Willowbrook, architect of its cruelties, was unraveling in full. Doctors would later struggle to name what he endured: every organ system collapsing at once, every poison working in chorus. His body bled from within, pooling beneath his chair. His nerves misfired in spasms too jagged for words. His heart faltered, pushing the last threads of circulation through a vessel already defeated. The younger guests fared no better. Their bodies, leaner and more vigorous, resisted longer, fighting the inevitable. Their resistance only prolonged the horror. Shrieks and gurgling cries filled the air, the echoes of youth smothered by chemistry's cold arithmetic. And through it all, Celia moved. Calm, steady, efficient, no longer serving delicacies but water. No longer presenting dishes but rearranging pillows, wiping blood, holding trembling hands. She tended to their dying bodies with the same quiet care she had once given her own children. Yet, there was no pity left in her. For 18 years, she had watched these same people laugh at torture toast over suffering, turn cruelty into theater. Her heart had long ago hardened past compassion. What she felt now was not vengeance. It was justice. Cold, inevitable. Delayed but delivered at last. The irony was merciless. Celia, the enslaved woman they had dismissed as less than human, now gave them more tenderness in their dying hours than they had ever shown to the hundreds who had perished beneath their authority. She wiped their faces, offered water, folded hands, acts of dignity, denied to every man, woman and child they had reduced to property. By 11, the first deaths arrived. Mrs. Pembroke, who only hours earlier had spoken of the necessity of strict control over household slaves, succumbed to heart failure and respiratory collapse. Her last expression bore the unmistakable trace of recognition, a fleeting understanding that her end was bound to the cruelty she had endorsed all her life. Judge Claiborne's son, 16, died next. His convulsions were so violent, they broke his bones, his youth keeping him conscious long enough to endure the full arc of the poison's work. His death was not just personal tragedy, but a terrible initiation into the system he had been brought to inherit. The interval deaths became a grim procession. Each body that fell was not only a life extinguished, but the final consequence of decades of choices. Profits measured against suffering cruelty, defended as necessity. Senator Pembroke collapsed in a trail of blood, clawing toward the door. His political career ended not with applause in the Senate chamber, but in a pool of his own organs, collapsing from within. Colonel Fleming died, shattering the crystal in his hand, the shards cutting him as the final seizure stole his breath. By midnight, only 3 remained alive, though life in them was no more than the twitch of poisoned nerves. 14 corpses ringed the table, once set for celebration. Colonel Rutherford lingered the longest. His size, his strength, once the very symbols of mastery, now prolonged only his suffering. As his body unraveled, clarity pierced through the haze of agony. He saw at last the truth he had spent his life denying. His death was not misfortune nor accident. It was consequence, the inevitable return for every demonstration of pain, every innovation in punishment, every choice to trade humanity for profit. His final coherent thought was not of God nor of legacy, but of Celia. Celia, whom he had never granted the dignity of thought or will. She had outmatched him, strategist, tactician, architect of justice. She had achieved what no court, no law, no polite society in Mississippi would ever allow accountability. At 12:30 a.m., July 13th, 1851, Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford died in the house he had ruled undone by a woman, his records listed as property. His last breath marked the close of the largest act of resistance in the history of American slavery, a single night that raised 17 of its most powerful defenders. When dawn rose over Willowbrook, the scene belonged not to history books, but to Gothic nightmare 17 corpses seated at a table still adorned with fine china crystal and linen. And yet, there was order. Celia had not fled. She had not hidden her hand. Instead, she arranged the bodies with dignity, closed eyes, folded hands, giving to them in death the respect they had never granted in life. Not to exonerate, not to soften, but to make certain the story would be read clearly by those who came after. It was not merely murder. It was testimony. The first discovery came with morning light. Household slaves arriving to set the day's duties in motion entered the dining room and froze. 17 bodies slumped in postures of collapse, their faces twisted in expressions of pain or stilled into eerie calm. The room, still laid with silver and crystal, had transformed overnight into a mausoleum. Panic spread first within Willowbrook, then across Yazoo County. No explanation seemed possible. Some whispered of plague, others of curses or divine retribution. The boldest guessed at poison, but none could fathom the complexity that had unfolded at the dinner table. By mid-morning, riders had carried the tale across plantations. Crowds of planters' officials and the merely curious gathered, drawn by what they were already calling the greatest mystery in Mississippi's history. Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw, whose experience extended only to livestock thefts and neighborly disputes, found himself at the center of an investigation that exceeded his imagination. No doors forced, no weapons drawn, no sign of intrusion. 17 dead simultaneously as if by a single hand of fate. Dr. Marcus Harrison arrived at noon, summoned reluctantly from his own home. Denied attendance at the dinner by Celia's forged message, he now examined the corpses with professional precision. The symptoms spoke to him clearly poison. Yet, the sheer variety, neurological, cardiac, gastrointestinal, pointed not to a single substance, but a calculated orchestration of many, requiring knowledge, both of plants and of the human body. Complications multiplied with every hour. A senator dead, a judge silenced multiple planters. Lost, each corpse carried threads of political and economic consequence. Cotton shipments disrupted, court rulings imperiled, networks of slave trading unsettled. The tragedy was not contained within Willowbrook's walls. It reverberated through the very structure of Mississippi society. Soon suspicion settled where it inevitably must. Celia, the enslaved woman who had overseen the meal. Her serenity at first disarmed questioners, yet evidence emerged that told another story. In the root cellar, investigators unearthed dried plants, improvised distillation tools, stains of residue. In hidden drawers, they found carefully kept notes, records of chemical extraction calculations, of lethal doses adjusted by weight and constitution. The most damning discovery was a journal. In its pages, Celia chronicled not only her preparations, but her thoughts, an interior world her owners had never credited her with possessing. Each entry dismantled the racial mythology upon which their authority rested. She analyzed her master's appetites, recorded their habits, mapped out the arc of their deaths with the precision of a strategist. But interwoven with the calculations were reflections searing articulate meditations on morality, faith and justice. On June 20th, she had written, "They believe we are animals incapable of moral reasoning. Yet no animal treats its own kind as they do us. They call upon God to defend their cruelty, yet break every commandment of mercy. If I am damned for what I plan, then surely they are damned already. The difference is this: my act ends suffering. Theirs prolongs it forever. On July 8th, only 5 days before the dinner, I know I will not live long after them. But 17 fewer voices will rise to defend this evil. Each of them wields power that stretches beyond their fields. To silence them, even for one night, is to carve an opening in a wall that has stood too long." The journal recast the massacre not as madness, but as design and act, at once intimate and historical murder and manifesto. The discovery of Celia's writings unsettled Yazoo County more profoundly than the corpses themselves. Here in her own careful hand was evidence that an enslaved woman had not only mastered knowledge of chemistry and physiology, but had also engaged in moral reasoning that pierced through the justifications of slavery. Her journal revealed a mind capable of strategy, reflection, and defiance, qualities her owners had denied she could ever possess. The implications were terrifying for white Mississippians. If one woman legally defined as property could conceive and execute such a plan, what prevented others from doing the same? For some, the answer was clear: harsher laws, tighter restrictions, harsher punishments. But for others, especially in the North, the Willowbrook massacre became a revelation. It was no longer possible to argue that the enslaved lacked intelligence or moral sensibility. By the time Celia was brought to trial, the entire nation was watching. On August 15, 1851, the Yazoo County Courthouse overflowed with reporters, planters, and curious onlookers. Judge William Thornbrook, summoned from Jackson after the death of Judge Claiborne in the massacre, presided. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Hawkins, struggled with the paradox how to prove that a person legally defined as property could also be morally and legally culpable for murder. The defense, composed of abolitionist lawyers who volunteered their services, argued that Celia's actions were not only rational, but morally justified. They presented records from Willowbrook educational demonstrations in which enslaved men, women and children were tortured to death as lessons in discipline. Witnesses described punishments so brutal that even jurors visibly recoiled. The turning point came when Celia herself took the stand. Her voice was steady, her words deliberate. She described her planning, her choice of poisons, her reasons. But she also framed her actions as a deliberate strike at a system built on blood. "I knew my death would follow theirs," she told the court. "But I also knew that in dying, they would be prevented from torturing hundreds more in the years to come. They treated us worse than beasts, yet claimed to be Christians. I ended that cruelty in the most efficient way possible, and I accept the price of that choice." The jury required less than 2 hours. Their verdict, guilty on all counts, was less a judgment on Celia's deeds than a refusal to confront the dangerous implications of her reasoning. Judge Thornbrook sentenced her to death by hanging. On September 3, 1851, thousands filled the public square of Yazoo City to witness what newspapers called the most extraordinary trial in American history. Celia mounted the gallows with the same composure she had shown throughout. Her final words delivered to the hushed crowd became a rallying cry in abolitionist circles: "I die, knowing that I have struck a blow for justice that will echo through history." The 17 I killed devoted their lives to the brutalization of people who had committed no crime but being born black. If my death serves to reveal that truth, then it is not in vain. The trapdoor fell. Silence. Then a roar of voices, some triumphant, others shaken to their core. In the months that followed, her story spread across the country, retold in pamphlets, sermons, and abolitionist papers. To her enemies, she was proof of the danger of educating the enslaved. To her allies, she was a martyr, a strategist, and most of all, a woman whose defiance could not be erased even by death. Their deaths brought an end to decades of torment and prevented decades more from unfolding. If there is justice beyond this life, then God Himself will judge between their deeds and mine. I am content to accept that judgment. Celia's execution marked the formal conclusion of legal proceedings surrounding the Willowbrook massacre. Yet, the echoes of the case reached far beyond the courtroom, rippling through American society in ways that challenged its most entrenched assumptions. The meticulous planning she demonstrated, the intellectual discipline revealed through her writings and testimony, and the striking moral framework she articulated, these elements unsettled the very foundations upon which antebellum Southern society had justified slavery, race hierarchy, and human bondage. In the months following her death, unexpected discoveries gave the case new dimensions. Hidden across the Willowbrook plantation in attics beneath floorboards and inside hollowed walls, investigators uncovered a trove of correspondence between Celia and enslaved men and women on neighboring estates. The letters revealed a communication system far more advanced than white authorities had ever imagined. Written in a hybrid code, African languages blended seamlessly with English, they described intelligence networks that had been operating quietly for years. These records contained chilling precision accounts of punishments inflicted, catalogues of deaths and disappearances, genealogies of families fractured by the slave trade. Enslaved people working in secret had preserved the very histories their masters sought to erase. The documents showed that Celia had not acted alone. She was supported by a vast network, men and women who supplied her with materials, crafted alibis, and shielded her movements. Their coordination revealed an organizational sophistication that demolished the demeaning assumptions used to justify their subjugation. Most startling of all, the letters exposed the broader intent behind Willowbrook. The massacre had not been an isolated act of desperation, but the opening move in a campaign meant to stretch across Mississippi and into neighboring states. Celia's strike was intended both as a demonstration and a signal proof that resistance could be strategic, collective, and devastating. When this revelation reached plantation owners, fear spread like wildfire. The possibility that enslaved cooks or house servants might poison food at their tables led to sweeping changes. Food tasters were employed, kitchens, locked storerooms, secured, and enslaved workers subjected to relentless scrutiny. Daily life on plantations grew increasingly governed by paranoia as owners grappled with the realization that those they had thought powerless were capable of planning and executing sophisticated revenge. This fear had unexpected consequences. Many owners quietly reconsidered the brutality of their punishments, not from conscience, but from calculation. Excessive cruelty, they now understood, could provoke retaliation that would cost them more than any momentary assertion of dominance. The case also reverberated in the political sphere. By the 1850s, the national debate over slavery had reached a fever pitch, and Celia's story became a weapon in that struggle. Northern abolitionists seized upon her writings as undeniable proof enslaved people possessed intellect, strategy, and moral reasoning equal to any white citizen. Abolitionist newspapers published her testimony, widely holding it up as both indictment and inspiration. The South, however, spun the narrative in the opposite direction. Politicians and pro-slavery intellectuals argued that Willowbrook proved the danger of allowing enslaved people literacy and education. To them, Celia's sophistication was not evidence of equality, but a warning that knowledge itself was combustible in the hands of the enslaved. They pointed to the sophistication of Celia's planning as proof that education and intellectual development among enslaved people posed existential threats to white society. Threats that in their minds could only be contained through harsher punishments and stricter controls over any trace of independent thought. The debate ignited by the case widened the already growing gulf between North and South, a polarization that would, in less than a decade, explode into civil war. Northern newspapers published detailed accounts of the cruelties unearthed at Willowbrook, presenting them as evidence that slavery was fundamentally incompatible with both Christian morality and human decency. Southern publications countered by emphasizing the violence of Celia's act, arguing that it revealed the dangers of abolitionist agitation and the catastrophic consequences of encouraging resistance among the enslaved. Years later, during the Union occupation of Mississippi in the 1860s, federal investigators reopened the case files. What they uncovered revealed just how much had been buried, suppressed, or ignored. Testimonies from enslaved witnesses, voices silenced during Celia's trial, finally came to light, alongside documents pointing to resistance efforts on other plantations. These findings suggested that the Willowbrook massacre was not an isolated eruption but part of a much larger, coordinated pattern of defiance. One discovery stood out above all others: a hand-drawn map by Celia herself. Carefully inked, it marked the locations of mass graves across Yazoo County. Each site carried notes, names, ages, causes of death, brief stories of lives extinguished. Archaeologists during reconstruction followed her directions and uncovered skeletal remains that bore the unmistakable signs of torture, mutilation, and execution. Forensic analysis confirmed what her writings had long claimed. The systematic violence of slavery was not anecdotal, but structural and pervasive. These revelations sparked posthumous legal proceedings. Several plantations were seized, their lands redistributed to freed people as part of Reconstruction's fragile attempt at justice. Yet those programs were dismantled by the late 1870s, leaving Celia's map as both a record of horror and a monument to unfinished reckonings. The Willowbrook Massacre's true legacy extends far beyond antebellum Mississippi. Celia's life and actions demonstrated intellectual brilliance, strategic foresight, and profound moral reasoning that shattered the racist myths underpinning slavery. Her journals opened rare windows into the inner lives of the enslaved, lives filled with grief resilience and ethical reflection. Modern historians now regard her Last Supper as one of the most sophisticated acts of resistance in American history, its precision comparable to military operations of the Civil War era. Celia's moral philosophy, articulated in secret writings and in open court, remains extraordinary. She argued that violence against oppressors was not cruelty, but necessity, justified when it prevented far greater suffering of the innocent. Her reasoning echoes traditions of moral philosophy rarely associated in her time with those denied both freedom and education. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth of Willowbrook resistance takes many forms. Celia's deliberate elimination of 17 of Mississippi's most powerful defenders of slavery was both vengeance and liberation, striking at a system designed to crush all traces of her humanity. Her actions remind us that under even the harshest oppression, individuals retain agency, conscience, and the power to shape history through sacrifice and defiance. Still, mysteries linger. Were all the conspirators ever uncovered? Did other networks exist across the South? Their stories erased by time or silence. The sealed records of the case, kept from public view for nearly a century, suggest there may yet be truths hidden in private archives or family collections waiting to emerge. Celia's final supper, carried out on a humid July evening in 1851, removed from power 17 of the most brutal voices in Mississippi. Whether we interpret her actions as murder or as justice, they remain a reminder that even when society denies a person's humanity, that person can still assert it in ways that alter the course of history. More than 170 years later, her walk to the gallows, calm, resolute, with dignity unbroken, continues to challenge our understanding of justice, resistance, and the cost of freedom. What do you think of Celia's story? Do you believe everything has been revealed, or might there still be secrets buried in forgotten places? Share your thoughts below. And if this tale has gripped you, subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and pass it along to anyone who seeks out the hidden corners of America's past. Join us next time as we step into another chapter history tried to erase.